Concord. Agreement or harmony between people or groups. At least that's the definition and likely emotion that the Firewalk Studios team wanted to evoke, formed from the remnants of the Destiny 2 development team and those that worked at Bungie. Firewalk Studios just recently launched Concord August 23, 2024, after a reported 4 to 5 years of development and over $100 million in budgeting. And then, in a shocking turn of events following a very negative reception, FS would pull Concord not even a full month later, citing needing to go back to the drawing board. With Concord currently dead and its future very much in flux, and not in the most positive of directions, it's found itself on this series, Death of a Game, a series where we take the largest contributing factors to the death of a game or company and navigate a timeline of events in an attempt to collect clues and bits of evidence, all culminating in every detective's favorite final deduction at the end of the video. There's a lot to cover today, even for such a short-lived multiplayer shooter, probably one of the shortest lived that we've covered yet. We're talking DEI narratives, accusations of poor development, developers not taking feedback, and so much more. So choose your hero. I know there's not much to choose from, and let's get to the case, detectives. The story begins with the beginning of Firewalk Studios. Firewalk Studios had an interesting inception. For starters, it was actually founded in 2018 as a part of another company, probably Monsters, ran by former Bungie CEO Harold Ryan. Firewalk Studios also featured former Bungie staff including Tony Hsu, former GM of Destiny at Activision, Alina Siegman, former executive producer at Bungie, as well as more Destiny developers and some other veteran talent. Firewalk in a short time would team up with Sony Interactive Entertainment for an upcoming AAA multiplayer game and would boast a team up to 150 developers. This would likely give Firewalk the budget and support that they needed working with Sony to make their multiplayer shooter. It also pretty much guaranteed that it wasn't going to launch on the Xbox platform. Now, oftentimes, Sony works with studios and then they end up acquiring them too. This was no different with Firewalk, who was acquired by Sony 2 years later. Now, I must confess, I don't know exactly why, but I can speculate that they want to own the studio working on their IPs potentially and have more potential control in the process. Or perhaps make the developers working on their games more invested in working on them long term. But one thing was for sure, Sony and Firewalk were gearing up for a big announcement of their upcoming multiplayer shooter, and this was important with Destiny no longer receiving sequels or updates, and Sony these days lacking in the shooter realm. Concord, the secret multiplayer shooter having been worked on now for 3 years, would be introduced to the world May 24th, 2023. This would be Firewalk Studios' first title, a major AAA shooter. While this might be alarming for some, and it should be, if they had the veteran enough team and right leadership, they could make things work, especially with prior developers in the live service shooter world backing them. The trailer reveal for Concord, though, was perplexing to say the least. Now, I like it in the right context, but I have no idea what context this was even driving towards. And with the gift of hindsight, we know that this teaser did fuck all to really describe what Concord was supposed to even be about. And that's fine, you know, it's a teaser trailer and all. What was said was Concord was a bringing together of peoples. It's the power of games to build connection and inspire social play. The Firewalk team is driven by the type of exciting, unexpected moments and shared experiences that multiplayer games create. Every time you log on is the beginning of a new adventure, and every match is an opportunity for a new story. It's these ideals that define Concord, its unique universe of vibrant worlds, and its rich cast of colorful characters. This was sounding a lot like Destiny, maybe except for the last part, or something close to that with cooperative play and not just PvP. Overwatch and many other shooters lived off of teasing their game up until launch and the lore in it over the course of their marketing hype cycles, and they did so effectively by actually bringing life and humanity to their game and community, making players feel united in the way of the Overwatch. Just watch the teaser trailer. It's more about uniting humanity and stuff like that. Throw in this lengthy beta showcasing gameplay to many players on Twitch and YouTube as well, and Overwatch had a primed audience before they even launched. One teaser trailer isn't enough to doom anything, but it shows a misunderstanding to an extent of how to properly build a community and how to build and push effective marketing. Contrast this now with Valve's shooter, Deadlock, which they haven't even marketed at all, and is a personal favorite of mine. They just allowed people to access the game and invite each other to play, and then made sure to update the game and slowly build the community the old-fashioned way, from the ground up, just like League of Legends did it, just like Dota, and so many other successful multiplayer games. Sony was committing to live service games, however, as Sony president Toki would state, specifically launching 6 of those upcoming 12 titles by March of 2026. Concord was being listed as one of those live service titles. And for those out of the loop, live service basically means that when you buy the game, it continues to either introduce new monetization in the form of skins, missions, battle passes, or even DLCs and possible expansions. Of late, this has been associated with pay-to-win games or tragic failures like Anthem or Redfall, who got very hyped and then failed in nearly all aspects to deliver on such. But live service games aren't inherently bad, they just often feel like launching incomplete games that you have to pay for them to complete over time. They're just not good value propositions. The major cinematic trailer and gameplay reveal would drop at the same time, May 30th, 2024, and it's in these videos you can see more of a semblance of what Concord was supposed to be. For starters, the cinematic trailer was showcasing what looked to be Guardians of the Galaxy inspired vibes, understated a bit, with a cast of characters that seemed to be in delight and being silly or non-heroic. The problem was the first 3 characters introduced seemed straight lifted from Guardians of the Galaxy, and although they were partially charming, many were wondering what the trailer even had to do with the Freerunners being a band of criminals, especially with them being so happy-go-lucky. The trailer even talks about a rendezvous point, which sounds more like an extraction shooter or something, but something more glaring for me wasn't just how samey or generic the character designs were, it was how you basically could try to predict each of their powers and you would end up being wrong. That's not good character design, as in a character-based shooter or hero-based shooter. These characters need to communicate their role and abilities by how they look and how they play. With the gameplay trailer launching right beside it, it seemed to showcase what looked like a call to old arena action shooters in some ways, and a blend of more of a modern hero shooter in some ways too. While Concord looks impressive in many ways, the color palette, the environments, and the particle effects, even during this trailer, you could see people hesitant that it would be fast enough or unique enough of a concept to even last. And again, we have so much lack of tone and vision, where so many things just feel strapped together from different IPs and different games. Concord even early on just looked like a generic shooter, and the final scene just feels out of touch, again, which makes it seem like Concord had committed to this as a style of storytelling. Because Freerunners, they're not heroes, they're professionals. And there's nothing wrong with criminals being likable in a video game, but the Freerunners felt a lot more like a church basketball league where it's lame and tame and full of squares and you can't even do things like celebrate or say cuss words. And I played in one of those so I can attest. But I don't get the punchline is what I'm trying to say. Professionals aren't always so likable or witty. They have to be relatable, especially professional murderers, right? The tone seemed completely off, and my thought is that they wanted to attract a younger audience, hence the clash. But that's not to say that Concord had to be super unique, but if it wasn't unique, it had to be iterative, the Japanese design style approach, and basically outdo Overwatch in all of its aspects. Both were going to be some difficult tasks, and for those wondering why, well, Concord had a reported budget of upwards of $150 million, meaning that there was a lot of money on the line for the game to just be a middling title. It had to be a hit. The expectations were being set sky high. The beta for Concord would take place July 2024, and I have a number of issues with this. For starters, unless it's a proper closed beta, the chances that the dev team can actually affect change to the scale that they might need in the short amount of time they would be given was going to be nearly impossible. I think this is an issue that many shooters run into lately, where they retroactively try to create a community instead of building one from the get-go. The interesting thing, and I will spend quite a bit of time remarking about it, is that the critics weren't even negatively receiving Concord in beta. In fact, I rounded up 8 different articles from a range of different journalists and found them to be rather positive in their feedback. The truth is, video game journalism in the critical sense from the media has been suffering for quite some time. Issue being, media outlets are directly incentivized to lowball their bad reviews and glaze their good ones, and are given very little time to review games. It would be a hypothesis if there wasn't already so much evidence to the contrary. Look at how the media treats COD titles that don't innovate or iterate. Game Rant stated that Concord in their experience had a level of polish and graphics not common in games like this, down to the environments and the characters being detailed. Game Rant would also state that they felt Concord had a unique identity and enough firepower to be a proper multiplayer shooter in the current market. Couch Soup's thoughts were basically like the classic I don't play this kind of game and probably won't impressions, but very positive ones. Partly due to the lack of experience probably, and a lack of understanding the market and the genre in particular. They aren't the target audience, which might seem like a strength, but you first need to have your own core audience, and I was trying to find that for Concord. Monster Vine in their impression stated that the game didn't seem like a trendy game, and yet acknowledged right after that, throughout their article even, that the game reminds them of other games. Digital Trend acknowledged at the very least that there didn't seem to be anything unique like a main gameplay hook, but at the very least found the game as a fun shooter not trying to overthink the genre. Which sounds like a compliment, but it's kind of more of like milquetoast the game. The super glazing part starts to happen with PC Gamer's review. And to be fair, your initial impressions can always change, but that should also be explained in your criticism and your later takes. Where I take issue seriously is that the writer, Morgan Park, had apparently never played any other hero shooters, because they would say things like that there were things like fun hooks I don't instantly recognize from other games. Anyone watching now can easily identify almost all of the aspects in heroes from other games. So what are we doing, PC Gamer? Maybe besides the whole team select thing that after each round of completion, it makes you play a new hero, which although it sounds like a cool concept because it incentivizes you to want to play new characters because you want to get the passive bonuses that you could get from them, as well, they don't really give you a choice. Incentivizing you and not giving you a choice aren't the same thing, and it seems like Concord was going to struggle to understand the differences there. And although PC Gamer doesn't talk much about this particular aspect, many other impressions did as a strength, and I think that might be because it's unique, and one of the only unique things about Concord. I think of it more of like a good idea that's honestly probably poorly executed. But in this article we have yet more comparisons to COD and Overwatch at the same time, with claims that the much slower, less gun-dependent game is somehow more COD-like. I really question how many of these journalists even played the game, let alone shooters period. Eurogamer in general is a great nuanced site, but in their impressions here, it's like they don't even complete their own conclusions. They say Concord feels like a hodgepodge of games combined, and yet feel that the gameplay hook for the game will magically reveal itself post-launch because gamers will metagame? Huh? GameSpot acknowledged the difficult position that Concord was in, but felt like they built a solid foundation for the sci-fi multiplayer shooter, which seems like quite high praise for playing most likely less than 10 hours of a multiplayer shooter. But the writer, Jake Decker, also acknowledges that the characters feel asymmetric and yet the map feels symmetric, which is actually an interesting point. Finally, coming from a little-known outlet and a girl, DEI warriors, the gamer would put out a scathing critique from the beta asking what even is the point of Concord. Stacy would acknowledge the gameplay looked the same as other shooters that were similar, and the game felt like it lacked individual or team-guided passion. Stacy also would acknowledge that the characters were mostly forgettable. Finally, the whole original pitch, they would state, that matches the trailers and such of progressively building your world and revealing the lore and characters to your audience over time, didn't really seem to match up to other games like Helldivers or Destiny even, that could offer much better experiences there, especially because they weren't just PvP. My main point in this section is not just to shit on other video game critics, but shit on them in a way where I can teach you guys that that kind of soft glove handling is what leads to surprise failures like this in part, and not learning from it. Poor criticism and game coverage leads to the chances of players purchasing more bad games, or the game not having to prove itself that much. What I found so alarming about these impressions is that many of them 180 after the game launches, or many of those same critics start running defenses for the game. And while changing your opinion is totally fine, especially if it's grounded into something, I don't really feel that these critics are helping the industry learn many lessons from the situation, and are actually poisoning the well even to a certain extent. You might argue perhaps none of the writers were able to see what was coming, and due to just chance or circumstance perhaps, but I don't really fully buy that. I think this highlights an issue with video game critics and their coverage of major titles. They don't play the games enough to really have that much of an opinion, and the opinions offered weren't the least bit critical, nor looking to the future. It feels like many of these articles were just marketing, and that's a strange feeling. Because under the surface of all of this hype that I just listed, all of these outlets, and I didn't even cover all of them, only 2,388 players peak had played the game, which is so divorced from the game's media coverage you would seriously be shocked to learn that. And this was a free beta, which means that even when the game was free to play, people still weren't interested in playing it. Amazon's new secret-level TV series would feature an entire episode featuring Concord in it, showing that Sony wasn't failing to try to pull out some major stops to try to help things, to make sure that their new AAA shooter was going to be a hit. Concord wouldn't have that much time in the hype cycle and would launch shortly after its gameplay reveal and early access test, August 23, 2024. Launching on PS5 and Windows, Concord was a first-person hero shooter where you played as one of the free gunners, professional criminals who are attempting to make their way in the galaxy, aka winning matches and killing people in the matches, but their personalities and cinematic intros would be reportedly revealed over time, so maybe it would help build that whole concept. Concord would receive a middling 62 out of 100 from 45 different critics and a much worse audience reception. But first, let's cover the media reception, cause I have some names to catch up with. Couch Soup would state that they weren't surprised, but let down. However, when you read their previous impressions, they were only positive and even suggested people to buy the game. Then in their more recent article, pushed that, well, it was already predetermined. And then that they wanted to anyway try the game and break the cycle. I have no idea what any of this means. Digital Trends was rather positive in their review, basically arguing that because the market doesn't like the game, it will fail. Wow, tantalizing analysis, which make you personally liking it, especially without couching that context, pretty useless, right? Now, PC Gamer is an interesting case. First, we have two different journalists covering the game, so the differing opinions aren't that wild, but editors also approve articles, and you don't only have to rely on your own perspective. Sometimes talking things over with another panel or other writers is helpful to see where you stand. But the PC Gamer review is one of the most negative ones now, stating that the game feels out of touch and out of time, and that the characters are mostly duds, as well as the world itself being way too full of poor Guardians of the Galaxy, Borderlands, and Firefly type humor. That's because, as I add, the issue with these comparisons are that, well, these are crew-based shows and games, and Concord, despite pushing itself as one, wasn't really. It was PvP only focused as a shooter, which feels quite different than a crew-based cooperative game. Eurogamer has something interesting happen. Their main review, completely different than their Portuguese review. The main review starts off with writer Rick Lane literally mocking the concept of the game and the genre itself. Great start. Then they argue, well, the game didn't work because the genre isn't really that old and it's just more of a fad. Then they literally admit themselves that TF2 bucks that trend. The writer personal analysis aside, which is probably where most of my issue with the review lies, they actually acknowledge the game lacking properly identified characters, the limp and weird looks of them, and how the game modes were basically copy-pasted from other games, like Trophy Hunt being a variant of TDM, basically Kill Confirmed, being the most unique, and Signal Chase being the King of the Hill mode with multiple moving control points. However, in the Portuguese review, it's far more negative, and actually more helpful in its analysis. First, writer Jorge Salgado postulates that Concord not having a single player and coming from a single player developer and publisher was already a huge red flag, and they're kind of right. Second, they state that the game, despite its large budget of over 150 million reportedly, now also being reported at 200 million, was still poorly promoted. Jorge's review, which is the best review on the game in my opinion, goes on to acknowledge some of the bright spots of the game, such as the visuals, some of the heroes being actually fun, before making a scathing take that the game feels like it was made in ChatGPT without any unique element that makes it viable as an option. Finally, they point to the $40 price tag and how their game has no true unique hook to it. Their final point is one that I will expound on later because it's a great one that I agree with strongly, which is that Concord seemed far better suited as a Destiny-like space adventure game. But it should also be mentioned that a $40 price tag after Overwatch became free to play just seems kind of tone deaf. Now, ironically, IGN's initial coverage of Concord, including in the beta, was pretty tame, and actually acknowledged full well the game had some serious hurdles to overcome. However, not that it doesn't make sense monetarily, IGN's post-coverage is much more glazier. They would state in their conclusion that Concord isn't the most innovative or content-heavy hero shooter you could play, but with such fantastic competitive gameplay, 16 compelling characters to master, and 12 well-designed maps, it's got the makings of something that could go the distance in the months and years to come. In fact, it's a testament to its FPS chops that even while it has virtually non-existent story and a serious need for signature game modes, I still found myself losing dozens of hours to its PvP charms. Hopefully, the live service roadmap will do its thing and show this promised shooter the love it needs to become something truly special. But right now, it's at least good enough for me to recommend trying out. And you have some of the largest copium I've seen and spotted in these reviews. Literally, in spite of the evidence staring you in the face, like the beta player numbers and the launch numbers on Steam being abysmal, how can you say with a straight face, even ignoring all of the other points already raised, that Concord had a bright future? Well, IGN, you start to see why people stopped taking you seriously a good time ago, at least in a proper critical circle. While your opinion is sacred in the sense of it is your own, you can make it your own uniquely or follow someone else's if you choose. The problem here is that these aren't just opinions, they are analysis and journalism from actual paid journalists and paid media critics. And thus, there has to be a standard, and sadly, it seems as if, largely, the major video gaming media outlets are just only getting worse. Concord would only sell 25,000 copies, and according to IGN's analysis cited, the main reason was that, well, it was an oversaturated market. Where do I even start with this? Simply being a hero shooter doesn't magically make your game untouchable or unplayable. It means that you have to measure up against your competition just like in any other context in business. The answer isn't start competition, it's a product that's not good or strong or unique enough to stand up to that competition in the first place. Gaming is competition, business is competition, and they lost competitively. The IGN article further talks about how analysts state that the game isn't unique enough, but that the other games in the past got by not being unique because they just cashed in on being a hero shooter in a hero trend. How does this shit even get published? Their examples are Valorant and Apex Legends. These aren't even the same kinds of game and aren't even the same kinds of game as Overwatch. They are distinctively different games with different designs and service different audiences, even amongst each other. And then we have claims that Black Myth Wukong is what shook Concord's player base. I mean, like, are you guys kidding me? Is gaming existing an excuse for them as well? And I will leave you guys with their final bit of analysis. Riveting as well, I might add. Sometimes everything that can go wrong does go wrong, although it's quite rare to see everything go this wrong. Wow, I'm sure glad I just read through and analyzed this IGN article supposedly based on talking to other analysts. Fuck me. This is a senior IGN writer and a team supporting her, and they've offered nothing but dud analysis and coverage on Concord the entire time. After Concord's major failure, though, eyes and expectations were already turning to other live service multiplayer shooters that were supposed to come from Sony, like Marathon, which was recently swapped to an extraction shooter like Tarkov, and then Fair Game, or Fair Games, a heist-based shooter with very little details revealed other than it's being developed by Haven Studios, which is one of the other studios under Sony's wing. Even if Sony could try and learn from their major mistake that just happened, they didn't even almost have enough real time to apply their lessons, and were going to have to likely take more egg on their face in the process. Now, as much as I, unlike many of you probably will feel in the comments, I don't actually delight in seeing games enter this series, especially early on, in very controversial ways. And as much as I want both of these shooters to succeed, Marathon for OG reasons and Fair Game because I love heist games, I don't really have the highest hopes after seeing how Concord was handled even from the Sony perspective. Sony has no excuse not to promote or market their games better, especially with so much money riding on the line. And with Concord already receiving such negative feedback and backlash and poor sales, the chances of that improving anytime soon just weren't going to happen, and the opportunity and window were already well missed. In a shocking turn of events, even for a game that was receiving quite the middling reception, Sony would announce that September 3rd, 2024, that Concord would be brought down on the 6th, just weeks after its launch. Sony stated that they wanted to determine the best path ahead and they would be offering refunds to the game. Now, would this be an Anthem scenario where a massive rebirth change and patch was promised but never comes? Or perhaps they would actually commit to feedback and work on developing something closer to what people would enjoy, sort of like No Man's Sky. Now, the first thing that's different is that Sony immediately offered full refunds, so that's a big difference in the Anthem scenario. But I don't really think that Sony and Firewalk are prepared to, especially with such a poor reception, to dedicate to sticking to their game. Especially when, in my opinion, much of the game, including its whole base foundation, is kind of shaky at best. I think a good way to analyze this is seeing how the developers react to things, and I have gone through tons of tweets and articles concerning this, and while many people will try to construct a narrative that somehow being proud of your own work even if it failed is an evil thing, and more room temperature equals stuff, it seems largely that the most negative part of the developer reception is that they don't outright acknowledge the failure, which is a fair criticism to be fair, but you can't from that then spin that the developers believe that they did no wrong or that they don't also acknowledge any of the faults. The problem is that if you want to keep working on your game, and also keep working on future games, facing things head on is much better because it builds or rebuilds trust. Where things get a bit too performative for me, in a non-helpful sense, is when a bunch of developers came out and started expressing solidarity, many of them using their own game examples, like Spellbreak or Cliffy B with Lawbreakers, as trying to say that they could understand the pain. And in a broad sense, I'm sure they can. I'm sure there's a lot of similarities. But this was a unique failure, and not seeing it that way is not helpful, even for your own growth, which is, why it's not really surprising to see Cliffy B being one of those to join in. I just dislike the narratives from other developers that started erecting, where they say that you didn't deserve this, or that you shouldn't be ridiculed this much, and I have to completely and vehemently disagree. First off, I believe in free speech. Second, anyone who creates art publicly opens themselves up to failure. Publicly, aka being judged by the public eye. Yeah, there's rules and rules of the establishment, but the whole concept of the public eye getting to mock you is not really fair, but it's existed for thousands of years. I'm not saying they get to full-on mock you, trust me, that's not something that I even appreciate in my comment section, as many people have figured out even more so recently. But I don't really understand the deserve this sentiment. Nobody deserves a failure or being criticized per se, but when you have a lot of money on the line, high expectations, and you chose a controversial approach in a certain sense, and again, you're releasing public art, why are you surprised when people are there to be critical of said things? Not all critics and critiques will be good. In fact, most analysis in general sucks, just like I've pointed out already, especially from a general gamer, sorry. But what you have with Concord in many ways is real issues and real flaws of a game and its design being caught up in a culture war in the process. And maybe that's also why the developers and other developers are kind of weighing in on things. What I mean is this, I'm actually going to defend Concord and its developers for two things and two things only. One, they attempted art, publicly. Anyone who does that has my respect. But the second thing that I will defend is this lazy and fairly idiotic narrative surrounding the game and its team to an extent, that it's somehow being woke and DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion filled is what made the game fail above all else. And me not pointing that out means that I'm the shill. Go woke, go broke. Then why do all major corporations have LGBTQ+ pushes, little pins and flags? Because even if they are just being performative and they don't support the rights of humans, they aren't stupid enough to fully alienate paying audiences because they can make money off of them. And trust me, corporations care a lot more about money than values. But don't get me started on the narrative with the Sweet Baby Inc. and some of the other games that I've covered, a company that's also worked on some of the biggest hits in the past 10 years. So simultaneously, when you fail, it's all your fault, and when you succeed, well, you didn't really have any real involvement. So it doesn't count. It's like a child's logic. But let's focus on the woke narrative for Concord for a second, and for the rest of the duration of this segment. Prominent woke discoverer website DEI Detected had the following analysis to add. A robot has pronouns, along with other chars. The women are fat and ugly, and one of them is masculine. But don't worry, they have proof. They point to Sony, a corporation who benefits from being inclusive because on their website they reference DEI initiatives. Where to even start? Well, a corporation making money off of being inclusive. Wow, that's very surprising and not very good proof. But a robot having pronouns is kind of funny to me because all sci-fi IPs have the ability to gender your robot to an extent. That's what modulators are for. What a totally idiotic and also ignorant thing that you would also have to have ignored popular media to have missed already to take issue with then and then blame a game's failure on is cartoonish. The second reason being a cast of ugly and fat characters. Now this is where I mentioned the narrative actually coinciding with real analysis and true issues. That's because when people identify issues with the heroes and their likability and broad appeal, they're right. That's true. The characters in Concord aren't very heroic or cool and lack visual identity, so it's difficult to understand what they do or what their personalities are, and in many cases are either generic or simply not appealing as a character design. Very similar to Lawbreakers. So maybe Cliffy B should be talking about this topic. While the fool points to reasons they manufacture first in their head, then confirm with their eyes in earnest called confirmation bias, the reason that the heroes aren't appealing is fairly simple. Not many people find it very heroic to play as characters who don't look very heroic. Sorry, a fat rounded character as in most of her armor is also round and her belly is not exciting to look at nor play as and doesn't motivate me or many players to do anything either. You can do so many other variants of the same idea, like Zarya or Ayla the Huntress in Skyrim. There isn't anything wrong with being a big, strong girl, but Daw or Duchess doesn't look big or strong. They look like you could roll them off of a cliff. And sorry, we're talking professional criminals here. In a competitive shooter environment, it's so hard to stomach so much of that. I mean, I'll just self-insert here and say that, like, my grandma grew up on the farms of Minnesota and in the south of Texas, and was way tougher looking or acting than any of the characters throughout this entire game, like Daw or Duchess. And as for the ugliness of the characters, this is a valid critique because players want to play characters that don't look like themselves. Gotcha. and myself. But seriously, you want to play a character who looks cool and feels cool. That's one of the best and most important things about gaming. With all the comparisons to Firefly and Guardians of the Galaxy, not a single member of the Firefly cast is unfit, nor doesn't have their own personality and utility. Now, as for the characters looking less feminine, this actually goes back to what sells. Sex sells. If you're questioning this in some deep ethical, emotional, or philosophical sense, please go do that off somewhere alone in a temple. Nobody cares, man. That's not how the world works, even if you or I don't want that to be the case. If sex sells, it means that sexy characters sell, and that works both ways.
Like a bisexual.
It doesn't mean your whole cast has to be fuckable, but it means that you probably should have at least most of your cast enough to make players excited to play them, honestly, just because of their appearance, potentially. And looking hot or sexy doesn't always have to mean just in some pure raw sense. It could also be because of the outfit, the fashion, and the personality. Now, a thing that I wanted to point out is that the hottest guy in Concord is Lennox, because you can see him and he's a dragon dude with male pattern baldness in the form of a mohawk. I'm just kidding. But Theo is probably the most conventionally attractive guy in the entire cast. The problem is that's not a very large compliment because he looks generic as fuck all. Mushroom Head and the old lady just don't do it for me either, and I've played tons of old ladies in video games like Twisted Metal and even Deadlock, and I root for the old lady in the anime all the time. But who are these characters even for? Who are the target audiences? This is what the character designers should have been questioning, while at the same time trying to find ways to maintain that character's unique identity and personality. Part of what helps in this process is character design through outline, without color. If you do this to most major shooters, you can determine what character, especially in hero shooters and MOBAs, is being played. Also, fighting games is another great example. The outlines in Concord, though, don't really give you much information, and they aren't very flattering either. They're kind of just like blobs and amorphous, like whatevers. Worse, the actual character designs themselves are detailed, high fidelity, but to what end? Why does Baz have a giant flowing coat despite being a ballerina murderer? As somebody who does martial arts and does a little bit of flipping, that seems unpractical to do flips in. Then you have characters like Hamar, who look nothing like their character actually acts or performs. She's a bowcast-wielding flame mage? She looks like a warlock or a blood priest. Is the bow because she looks like a vampire hunter? Meanwhile, Jabali looks like a less cool and ironically less gay-looking seer from Apex Legends. Meanwhile, check out this gameplay on screen and see how different and unique seer plays and looks. Roka looks a lot more like a generic version of Valorant's Raze, and you get the idea. I don't want to spend all video making these examples because there's so many to make. But even the things like the names of these characters don't do much favors in Concord. Like maybe Roka or Roka's like Rocket? But what does Jabali imply, or Hamar, or Baz? Meanwhile, you have other characters in other hero shooters like Raze, Seer, Genji, McCree, and so on and so forth. The main point that I want to make is that the character design sucking in Concord is true, but it has very little to do with the character's pronouns or if they're gay. It has a lot more to do with their character's design, its identity, and how it communicates and connects to those abilities, and finally, how it makes the players feel when you play them. For example, Raze in Valorant is gay as hell, fire and boom, and I enjoy playing her greatly, and I didn't even know she was gay until Killjoy was added later on. The problem is more of when you make it their sexual identity and preference, their actual personality. Here's what I mean. When you meet a gay person next time, or even a trans person, I bet you will make an interesting observation that most gay people, or even LGBTQ+ people, are fairly normal and not representative of the caricatures that you would often see in the media. The thing is, for some reason, for character designers in video games and movies and shows, it isn't enough. They must make a character also look full-blown gay, or full-blown bucking whatever social trend. In reality, they should be part of a character's identity, and it's okay for them to buck said trend, but it shouldn't be their sole personality, or the sole thing you see and think about when you look at them. Here's an example. I wish child poverty wasn't a thing, but if you make a hero for me and call it Mr. Stop Child Poverty and he's super on the nose, that's fucking lame, dude. Give me a rich Batman saving the poor people like me any day of the week. You can't make social issues a character. You have to build them into a character's identity in a way that's relatable and thus makes sense. And that's an issue that I have with the LGBTQ+ and DEI representation push myself, is in the process of doing it, they're creating tons of easy targets for angry onliners and anti-LGBTQ+ people to latch onto and then blame for failure. By not actually creating a proper character, this means a fun and liked character, even if she's gay, bi, fat, green, whatever, you're kind of doing more harm than good and designing a cast of characters people both forget and actually grew to loathe. But did you notice how I didn't just say DEI characters and call it a day? Well, because that's not actual analysis and doesn't even come close to telling the full scope of the issues. But brace yourself for the brave online DEI warriors in the comments calling me a shill because I don't have the same 3 brain cells that you guys do. The shit analysis doesn't end there though in my analysis of it either, this time going back to the world of video game journalism with another repeat customer, IGN. The analysis now is that, well, too much time in the oven is a bad thing. And that's right, as the analogy implies, of course. But when I see such painful logic, and IGN isn't the only one to push this, but it's written right here in the article, that being late to the party, according to IGN, means you have to bring something new to the table. Which is also true. But the issue with this logic is that it states, or implies, that if Concord launched 6 years or 8 years ago, it would have been a vastly different of an outcome. But my issue with this logic is it ignores most of the other issues we have already outlined, on top of the fact that it would still be going up against the competition already used as an excuse, but this time in their heyday. So again, we have this whole nothing burger with some truth tacked onto it, because yeah, it's true, the longer you take to launch on a market space, the more developed it becomes, which is why you have to become more unique. But something that must be also acknowledged is that since I see a lot of varying numbers floating around, I have only been told by my sources and read the public sources that the game was worked on for 4 years, and not this like cartoonish 8 or 6 that people have been repeatedly saying, which is older than the company making the game itself. This means that the game was in actual development by 2020 already, meaning that Overwatch was already out for 4 entire years. Meanwhile, TF2 was out for 13 years. Concord didn't have an excuse to not learn from its competition, nor the games that came before it. Instead, it seemed to try to borrow the best aspects from these games and then pile them all together into something that ended up barely being edible. Now, I've used this analogy before, but here we go again, the part Cajun Southern boy making his Cajun food references. Gumbo, man. Gumbo's incredible. It's highly customizable, combines all different kinds of proteins and textures, and is oftentimes quite spicy or flavorful. The thing is, it takes forever to make. No, seriously. Sometimes people feel gumbo is simply just piling a bunch of random things together with rice and sausage, and eating it. And while that's mostly true, Cajun food isn't as pretentious as the French counterpart. If you aren't careful, you can tip the balance too far into one direction and end up with a whole pot of barely edible gumbo. That's why it's important to stick with what works, and while making improvements where you can. So all the social politics aside, what about Concord was better than Destiny or Overwatch? Visuals, maybe, like the maps are gorgeous in Concord, and maybe even in a mechanical sense in some ways, but the visual identity of both of those games are far more positively received and remembered, let's not kid ourselves. So in the end, you have a game that copies most of its contemporaries, has shinier graphics, an unlikable cast, and seemed to, throughout the entire process of the game's development, lack a proper leader and someone willing to be the public-facing, no matter the negativity person. That's kind of what doesn't sit right with me about Concord. It feels like there's this lack of vision, but on top of that, a lack of vision usually implies a lack of proper leadership guiding towards that collective vision. Instead, it seems like a game by committee with none of the true benefits of such. I can't even tell you who the leader on the Concord project was up until I looked this stuff up, of course. And even with the gift of hindsight, I still really don't know. And sometimes not all designers are fit for leadership. But anyway, this is a red flag for me personally because it shows a development team or leadership team unwilling to stick their neck out and their own creativity and vision out there on the line and be an actual leader. We have police sirens going in the background because Concord has been busted. I'm just kidding. Contrast this to many other shooters and it's quite clear. If the devs really believed in Concord in the way that they were saying, it seemed that their leadership didn't, to the same extent, at least in my opinion. Because even if you take an experienced development team with a big budget and tons of support, if you don't lead them correctly, they can make a game that gets canceled in a few weeks despite how pretty it looks. And to be clear, as a leader myself, if I fail within just a few weeks or a few matches of a martial art match or something, I'm looking at that as a failure. I want to make one last comparison before my voice gives out and before I put this case to rest, detectives. One I feel that is very important for putting a bow on my analysis of the situation. Deadlock. And maybe this is just an excuse for me to talk about it because I'm having fun playing it as I put 60 hours into the game before it opening up 24/7, but Deadlock is Valve's in development multiplayer MOBA shooter. For me, the genius with Deadlock is, besides featuring the iconic Valve style and design in many ways, is that the game masquerades like a hero shooter, when in actuality, it's much more akin to Smite or Overwatch. In Deadlock, while you can focus on your aim with certain item combinations, most of the characters are ability driven, with guns serving as their kind of main farm and auto attack of a sort. Farming, of course, is killing creeps, or in this case, gathering souls, which allow you to gain gold or souls in this case, meaning that the game feels like a MOBA with guns. The game mode is also incredibly complex, despite seeming quite simple in MOBA terms. Not only does it have the classic MOBA approach of having lanes, defeat the main boss, and towers to win the game, with creeps pushing the different lanes and so on and so forth, it innovates the concept with different types of tower defenses in the way of the champions and guardians and walkers, and a zipline that allows you to travel quickly around the map that kind of reminds me of Heroes of the Storm. The map itself also promotes vertical play, not unlike the Paragon of old, and has tons of creep camps that you can farm, sort of like the jungle, as well as various buffs and souls littered throughout the map in the form of boxes and vases. Deadlock allows players from multiple genres, shooters and MOBAs, to come together and find a common place in a team environment with multiple characters offering all types of flavor. That alone makes it fairly unique. Throw in how much alike it actually is to games like Smite and Team Fortress 2 and even Dota with the items, and that those things actually help Deadlock, as players can easily identify them and their playstyles and characters from such easier. Especially because the character design in Deadlock is semi-realistic, and it doesn't have too much of the anime-looking stuff that goes on in Concord that makes it hard to even understand what's going on. It's just much easier to understand visually, including with the particle effects flying. Deadlock's characters are also just easier to understand in what they do by merely looking at the characters. Ivy flies around and drops hot sticky loads. Infernus is the flame guy, or flame man, you get the idea. They even have an LGBTQ+ character, and none of you would be any of the wiser as to who it actually is, unless you actually read and pay attention, which is actually how it should be. Concord was often touted quite positively that it was existing in this middle ground between Valorant and Overwatch, probably because it had 2 out of 5 modes be this one life Valorant style. And it was a hero shooter. But who was even asking for a middle ground between these two games? They aren't even the same style of game despite featuring heroes. And why make a PvP only title when you're selling so much about this concept of teamwork and unity, even into the characters themselves? Instead, you turned down the whole temperature of your series and made everything kind of seem very trivial. Instead, Concord ironically had the same issue as another game that I covered, Brink. No unique game modes that force unique hero designs and balancing, as well as make the game stand apart. Both games just took existing modes and barely tried to improve them. And the outcome was that they became featured quickly on this series just like this video. By just copying modes in your shooter, you're basically making it to where it's so hard to distinguish between those games and your game, and in the moments that you have to distinguish, if you aren't distinguishing positively, it's going to be seen as a negative thing. It also affects balance because balance becomes a lot more rock, paper, scissors because it doesn't have a choice in how you chose to design the game. I can't help but also feel that the same style and approach, but in something closer to a sci-fi space adventure game, would have fared just much better. It would have also allowed the developers to make the gameplay, even in the multiplayer, more rambunctious and not so focused on being as balanced as I talked about, which allows for a lot more fun thinking in ways of like Hearthstone, right? I guess when I envision a successful Concord, I envision this title that sheds the classic hero shooter meta and becomes something more of this casual and outside of the box shooter, like Borderlands or Destiny. Or even just think about shooters like Killzone, which I also covered in my Brink video. Killzone was a well-respected single-player series on the Sony platform that also had a pretty good multiplayer, especially Killzone 3. It's like Concord doesn't match any of the titles that came before it. And that doesn't seem like a positive thing, because it puts all the pressure on you performing in the only way you can perform. With that music playing, detectives, it means that we have analyzed enough analysis and been a meathead enough to reporters and supposed video game critics and gamers, and most importantly for this segment and this video, gathered enough clues and bits of evidence to solve the case. So for those who weren't paying attention or just missed the clues between the cracks and overwhelming amount of information, why did Concord die? No proper leadership. ChatGPT the game. Nearly no marketing or proper promotion. Failed to differentiate or build enough of their own design. Lack of single player or a content-filled multiplayer. Conflicting world and story design. Failure to understand character design in a character-driven game. Outdated business model. An engine change from UE4 to UE5. As well as, while it's not an official reason, I want to also mention that the game was being conceived during the height of COVID and that whole drama there. Now, there are many lessons to learn from Concord. That's why I spent so much time talking about criticism and being critical of it in this video, which is not something that I typically do, because I want people to take the right lessons from this entire thing and not choose the lazy and basement-dwelling takes that don't have much basis in reality and don't push gaming forward at all, nor really educate you on much. In a sense, it's letting Concord off easy, by just attributing its failure to some anti-ideology you don't enjoy, because so much more of the game was missing beside that. The game itself lacked a proper soul, and in my 6 years of covering this stuff on my channel and 15 plus years of testing major titles, this is one of the rare times that I can say that that was the case. Meaning it's one thing when a WoW clone or Korean MMO clone lacks originality, right? They have smaller budgets and you don't really end up expecting them to be that different. But when you have nearly 200 million in budgeting and you're backed by Sony, the expectations are much higher, and lacking originality in that case is kind of a literal game-ending sin. Because I've covered 100 titles plus and I've played way more to count, and the amount of times that I can say a game lacked personality is extremely low, especially in this context in a major title. That means that Concord's failure was less about needing to be more unique and more about not being anything special. A game too afraid to offend anyone. Thanks for watching.
All who lack honor shall wither. All who lack faith shall be lost. My loyalty is to the Emperor.